Kara Nichols faced her share of struggles, turning to drugs during her high school years and grappling with addiction well into her adult life. She started working as an escort at 17, but didn't give up on her dreams and sought a modeling career as she grew older. On October 9th, Kara mentioned to her roommates that she was off to Denver for a modeling gig and then vanished, sparking a trail of leads that ultimately led nowhere. For a time, the police even had an unidentified woman in their sights as a possible link to the disappearance. Over the years, there were supposed sightings of Kara, but none held up under scrutiny. However, the breakthrough in this perplexing case would come from the most unexpected source. Kara Nichols was born on May 20, 1993. Her dad, Paul Nichols, was a businessman. Her mom, Julia Nichols, kept her job out of the public eye. Though there's no official record, it seems Kara was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. She had an older brother named Terrence, who everyone called Terry, and a younger sister whose name has been kept private. Kara was the middle child, and her parents saw her as the heart of their family. But that wasn't the only reason everyone gravitated toward her. She had this unique charm and personality that made people love being around her. Kara was outgoing, full of life, and super creative. She had a magnetic and sweet nature, making her someone you just couldn't help but like. Even her teachers were fond of her. One of them felt lucky to have taught her, noting Kara's incredible potential from a young age. Growing up, Kara was a happy kid, but adolescence brought its challenges. At 13, she got caught shoplifting and had to do community service. During her sophomore year in high school, she struggled with severe depression after the family dog died. Despite her parents' efforts to get her counseling, Kara resisted and even refused medication. The exact cause of her emotional struggle remains unclear, whether it was due to lack of professional support or some unspoken traumatic event. During this tough time, Kara began using illegal substances, eventually turning to hard drugs like heroin, which led to more problems. She started high school in Colorado Springs, where she lived with her brother Terry. But due to her addiction issues, she transferred to a more alternative school where she could graduate at her own pace. From a young age, Kara was drawn to the fashion world, especially modeling and makeup. After high school, she was determined to chase her dreams, despite her battles with substance abuse. Before she turned 19, Kara was working as a waitress while pursuing modeling, mainly in lingerie. She also thought about enrolling in cosmetology school to further her passion. Without prior connections in the modeling world, Kara uploaded her photo portfolio to a social network-like platform for photographers and models. On her profile, Kara described herself as responsible and passionate about modeling. She was new to the scene but took her work very seriously. Her mother, Julia, said modeling was like an escape for Kara, almost as if she took on another identity while doing it. In 2012, around her 19th birthday, Kara faced a setback. Her substance use led her to quit her waitress job, losing her main income source. That summer, she returned to her family home in Chicago, Illinois. Back under her parents' care, they convinced her to seek help, and she entered rehab to overcome her addictions. However, her stay was brief. She was expelled for not following the program rules. In August 2012, 19-year-old Kara decided to move back to Colorado Springs. She made friends with other local girls and kept daily contact with her older brother, Terry. On October 9, 2012 at 11:45 p.m., Terry got a call from Kara, who said she was heading to Denver for a modeling job. That was the last time anyone heard from her. After that call, Kara vanished. 2 days later, on October 11th, after trying to reach her without success, Terry visited her rented room to check on her, which was unusual since he hadn't heard from her for a while. Kara's roommates, Jeremy Swope and Archie Escobedo, told him she had left for Denver on the night of October 9th. Later, her parents, Paul and Julia, came to Colorado to search for her. They found her makeup box, phone charger, and $300 in cash in her room, which was alarming as these items were precious to Kara, hinting she might be in trouble. However, it wasn't until October 14th that the family reported Kara missing to the authorities. Paul informed the sheriff's office about her history of substance abuse and recent rehab stint. According to Paul, the police didn't take the disappearance seriously, barely making an effort to announce it in local news, and suggested the family was overreacting since Kara was an adult and didn't need to check in daily. In December 2012, investigators learned about a photo of Kara on an adult content and escort service website. An anonymous tipster also claimed to have seen her in Las Vegas. Yet, after thorough digital tracking, detectives concluded that Kara wasn't connected to the escort ad. Her photo had been used without her involvement. The case's investigation progressed slowly in the months following her disappearance. Things changed when Detective Tammy Tadlock took over the case on February 4, 2013. By then, there were 2 more missing young models who had been seeking work on the same website Kara used to post her photos and portfolio. The then president of the National Coalition Against Violence and Exploitation of Women linked the site to at least 13 disappearances of young women who used the platform. The website issued a statement denying any wrongdoing, emphasizing their priority was to protect aspiring models and teach them how to spot scams. In the same year, Detective Tammy found an ad on a website for sexual services dated October 9, 2012, featuring a photo of Kara in lingerie. This discovery opened new leads, revealing that only a few of Kara's friends knew she also worked as an escort. One of these friends, who met Kara at a party a year earlier and whose identity remained confidential, shared that they both struggled with substance addiction and bonded over their time in rehab in 2012. This friend disclosed that Kara was never fully sober, regularly using small doses of heroin to stave off withdrawal symptoms, which helped her function daily. The friend also admitted to accompanying Kara to her escort appointments and confirmed that Kara financed her drug use with the money earned from these encounters. The case's renewed activity led to several calls to the authorities with potential leads. One call suggested shifting the investigation to Long Island, New York, but the law enforcement team found no evidence of Kara being there or involved in any sex trafficking network. On May 7, 2013, after accessing Kara's cell phone records, Detective Tammy's office left a voicemail for one of the last numbers contacted before Kara disappeared. The next day, Joel Hollendorfer, born November 19, 1975, and with a lengthy criminal record starting in the 1990s, returned the call. He had no known siblings and a history of theft, motor vehicle offenses, and harassment. Joel, who was 6 feet tall and weighed 194 pounds, had been married to Christina, with whom he had 2 children. His marriage was strained due to his drug addiction and frequent hiring of escorts. Joel's connection to Kara's disappearance seemed clear from the phone records, but his subsequent statement to Detective Tammy complicated the investigation. Joel confirmed owning the phone number in 2012 and said he spoke with a girl using a pseudonym that night. He claimed they texted and called for hours but never agreed on a meeting place, so he never met her in person. It was later confirmed that Kara worked as a prostitute under the pseudonym Joel mentioned. Detective Tammy pursued this lead, uncovering that Joel had listed his address in a place owned by his parents, John and Betty. A volunteer who analyzed Kara's phone records had been a reserve police officer in Santa Clara, California, and a manager for a special security program. A U.S.-based multinational company specializing in aerospace and military industries provided additional training to him in land navigation, a skill he used in the Army. Leveraging his acquired knowledge and the cell phone company's geolocation services, he mapped out Kara's last known movements from October 9th until the morning after, right before her phone went silent. According to the data, he placed Kara at the intersection of Goodman Road and Black Forest Road around midnight. This path, unusual in Kara's routine, was frequently traveled by Joel as it led to his house. Meanwhile, Detective Tammy discovered that on the day she disappeared, Kara spent time in her room with two brunette girls. By November 2013, authorities identified and located one of these girls from Colorado Springs, who cooperated with the investigation to piece together the events of October 9th until the friends parted ways. However, the second girl, who reportedly spent more hours with Kara that day, remained untraceable by Colorado authorities. Despite significant progress in piecing together Kara's last known activities and contacts, Detective Tammy was soon replaced as the lead investigator. Her successor doubted Kara's alleged modeling job in Denver, but couldn't prove or entirely dismiss it. More leads on Kara's whereabouts surfaced, yet none pointed in the right direction, with many suspected to be false, possibly meant to disrupt the search effort. Furthermore, new posts on the Escort website featuring Kara's photos appeared, some dated months after her disappearance. Police analysis confirmed Kara had no connection with these ads. For months, the police traveled across various U.S. cities and states, following the scant leads from their investigation, but to no avail. However, Detective Tammy's efforts finally bore fruit on October 2, 2014, over a year after first contacting Joel. The police obtained a search warrant for his parents' property, executed 13 days later using ground-penetrating radar. The team identified several altered ground spots. Betty, Joel's mother, guided the search, pointing out areas where they had buried horses and other animals since they bought the property in the mid-1980s. No excavations were made at these suspected animal burial sites. However, Betty suggested searching another property accessible to Joel on Green Acres Road. She contacted the owners, who allowed the authorities to search it. This second search took place on October 21 and 22, 2014. On the day of the search at the Green Acres property, police experts positioned 4 bloodhound dogs at each corner of the area. Once released, all dogs headed straight to the same spot, an area that looked recently dug up, about the size of a grave, but no human remains were found there. When the search at Green Acres started, Joel was interviewed by the police. In the recorded conversation, he confirmed speaking with Kara in October 2012, but his story changed. He admitted planning to meet her at the Waffle House, but claimed she never showed up. He also mentioned that his regular encounters with sex workers and drug addiction were the main reasons for his divorce from Christina. The detective in charge, observing Joel's reactions, explained that they had tracked Kara's movements that night using her phone's geolocation. Joel became more attentive, and the detective revealed that the last known location of Kara was just a minute away from his parents' house. Joel suggested that Kara might have followed him home to rob him, maintaining that he never met her in person. Frustrated by Joel's lack of cooperation and without new evidence, the investigation stalled for years. A breakthrough came in 2022 when Colorado Springs police located Christina Hollendorfer in Virginia. She had been reluctant to cooperate with the initial investigation, but during a meeting with the FBI, She revealed that after her father-in-law's death in 2014, Joel confessed to accidentally killing a sex worker by suffocating her during sex. According to Christina, Joel said the body was buried at his parents' property, above a horse's grave. Later, in a phone interview, Christina expressed her belief that Joel's parents, John and Betty, knew their son was responsible for Kara's disappearance and were covering for him. This testimony led to Joel's arrest. In custody, he met with the police investigators. They showed him aerial photos of his parents' property and asked him to identify the animal burial sites. When asked about a specific spot, Joel denied anything was buried there. However, a week later, when Betty was questioned, she contradicted her son, identifying the same spot as the grave of Milo, her favorite horse. Authorities quickly mobilized to uncover the mystery behind Kara's disappearance. A team of volunteers and FBI agents began a new search on the property, focusing on the area where Betty's horse was believed to be buried. Less than 3 feet underground, they found human remains, which were carefully extracted and sent to forensic experts for identification. It was later confirmed the remains were Kara's. The autopsy report noted significant damage to her brain, liver, and muscle tissues, suggesting a possible heroin overdose. However, due to the body's advanced decomposition, the exact cause of death couldn't be determined, so the authorities relied on Christina's earlier statement for the official report. Joel was immediately arrested on charges of second-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence. His bail was set at over $1 million. At a preliminary hearing on November 27, 2022, his defense lawyer argued that Kara's death was an accidental result of a consensual sexual encounter involving drug use, claiming Joel hid the body out of fear without intending her death. The prosecution countered this by stating that Kara had used up her remaining drugs hours before meeting Joel, making a drug overdose as the cause of death unlikely. They argued that Joel had killed her. The case judge concluded there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, ordering Joel to remain in custody without bail. The arraignment faced delays due to the defense's stalling tactics, aiming to buy time for Joel before the trial started. In January, when the first meeting between the prosecution and defense was scheduled, the defense lawyer chose not to make any statement. A month later, she pleaded not guilty on Joel's behalf, requesting a trial start date of June 12, 2023. In May, during a meeting discussing jury selection and media coverage, Joel's legal team objected to live social media broadcasts, arguing it could affect the trial's fairness. The defense also sought to dismiss the evidence tampering charge, citing the time elapsed since the incident. Finally, on June 10, 2023, over a decade after Kara's disappearance, the trial began. The prosecution made a striking start by displaying Kara's high school graduation photo, followed by images of the garbage bags where her remains were found. The prosecutor focused on Joel's actions, urging the jury not to scrutinize Kara's behavior. The defense attorney acknowledged Joel's involvement in Kara's death, but emphasized it was an accident, as per his ex-wife's statement. The trial featured 14 witnesses, including Kara's roommates, her family, her ex-boyfriend, and others who had contacted Kara for escort services, all claiming they never met her in person. Detective Tammy also testified, providing a detailed account of her investigation, followed by Christina, Joel's ex-partner. Christina delved deeper into their relationship during her testimony, especially highlighting Joel's 2014 confession. She described their marriage as unstable, marked by separations and reunions until they divorced in 2012. However, they reunited 2 years later. After Joel's father suddenly passed away, Joel took Christina in his truck to a gas station near his family's farm, where he confessed to killing Kara and mentioned he had disclosed the incident to his father, feeling he owed him an explanation after authorities searched the family property. Joel also believed he caused his father's death, attributing his heart attack to the shock of the confession. Christina, skeptical of Joel's story, remained silent on the matter until nearly a decade later when investigators approached her. The forensic pathologist who conducted the autopsy provided crucial testimony, noting high levels of heroin in Kara's system, but argued that drug overdose alone was an unlikely cause of death. He reasoned that Kara's habitual drug use would have increased her tolerance, making a fatal overdose less probable. However, he also noted that her heroin-affected state could have prevented her from breathing properly, not fully dismissing the defense's theory but maintaining a neutral stance, allowing both sides to leverage his testimony to support their arguments. Significant evidence presented at trial included the recording of Joel's first interview with Detective Tammy in 2014. After a lunch break, the prosecution called various crime scene experts who had been part of the initial search at the property where Kara's body was found, including volunteer geologists who explained the use of specialized equipment in 2014 to detect human remains, noting that while anomalies were found on the property, they could not confirm the presence of human remains at that time. In their closing arguments, the prosecution proposed that Joel, fueled by anger from being spurned by his ex-wife, sought out Kara for a paid sexual encounter. They suggested that his rage escalated during the meeting, leading him to strangle her to death. In the final stretch of the trial, the prosecution laid out evidence of Joel's repeated attempts to call his ex-wife on the day he met Kara, just hours before their encounter. The prosecutor challenged the notion that Joel's actions were merely reactions to an overdose death, suggesting instead that they aligned more with an intentional killing. The defense admitted Joel's actions were wrong but argued there was no concrete proof of his intent to kill. The defense's closing argument hinged on the lack of evidence to dispute the claim that Kara's death was accidental. 12 days into the trial, after nearly 5 hours of jury deliberation, Joel was found guilty of manslaughter, significantly reducing his potential sentence. Kara's mother, Julia, presented a heartfelt testimony that echoed the family's deep disappointment and shock at the verdict, feeling the jury failed to grasp the crime's severity. The judge, bound by the jury's decision, noted that Joel's prior convictions would be considered aggravating factors, potentially extending his prison time. On August 31, 2023, Joel was sentenced to 24 years in prison. This sentence left Kara's family and friends deeply disappointed, feeling the defense had unfairly blamed the victim. Kara's loved ones vowed to attend every parole hearing to ensure Joel serves his full sentence, publicly opposing any future parole. While Julia appreciated the judge considering the aggravating factors, she found the 24-year sentence too lenient, given the crime's gravity and the time Joel hid her 19-year-old daughter's body. The family also criticized the media's portrayal of Kara, arguing that instead of remembering her as the vibrant and kind person she was depicted as just another sex worker and addict. They emphasized that her profession did not justify her murder and the subsequent concealment of her body, which caused immense pain to her loved ones. That wraps up today's case. Remember to subscribe and hit the like button if you enjoy my content. See you in the next Unreal True Crime episode. Goodbye. The Story of Stacy Panel. Stacy Pinnell was born on September 5, 1967, in the small American town of Ripley, Mississippi. She had a younger brother and sister with whom she spent a lot of time and got along well with. Stacy was an energetic person with many friends. In school, she enjoyed participating in extracurricular activities. She joined the marching band, where she played a decorative wooden rifle. After graduating from high school in 1985, she attended Northeast Mississippi Community College in Boonville. Although it was about a 30-minute drive from her home, she decided to live in the dormitory. From the first days of college, Stacy was thrilled, made many friends, and joined the local marching band. On October 7, 1985, Stacy attended a training session after school, met up with her boyfriend, and went to a party on campus. At 12:30 a.m., she returned to the dormitory with her friends. They chatted for a bit, and then she went to sleep. At around 2:30 a.m., her roommate, Amy Wheeler, returned to the dormitory after the party but had lost her keys and had to knock on the door. The room was designed for 2 people, so only Stacy could open the door. However, there was no response to the knocking. Amy waited there for a few minutes before deciding to knock on the adjacent room's door. The dormitory was designed such that there was a common bathroom between the 2 rooms, so Amy could go through the bathroom of the adjacent room. A student named Stephanie Alexander lived in that room, who woke up to the knocking and opened the door. Both girls were surprised that Stacy did not respond to the knocking, so they entered her room together. The room was completely dark, and the only light came from a very dim lamp. Amy entered the room and saw Stacy lying on her bed, but one of her legs was hanging down, and she felt that something was not right with her friend. Getting closer, she was horrified to see blood on the bed. After recovering from the shock, she ran out of the room to get help. Other students responded to her screams, and the dormitory guard called 911. The police arrived and found an alarming scene. Stacy was dead, and there were traces of blood all over the room. There was a pillow over her face, and her underwear was pulled down. The investigators also noticed that someone had cut the mosquito netting of the window. Next to the bed, they found a wooden rifle that Stacy had used in parades with the marching band. It was covered in blood and wrapped in a towel. The police assumed the rifle had been used in the murder. Upon examining the crime scene more closely, forensic experts found a short hair on the victim's bed. All this was enough to form a preliminary picture of what had happened. Someone had made a hole in the window of Stacy's room, climbed in, raped, and murdered her. However, this version of events quickly revealed some inconsistencies. The size of the hole in the mosquito netting was too small for an adult to pass through. The window in question was situated at a certain height from the ground, which would have made the perpetrator's task more difficult. The police did not find the cut piece of the mosquito netting either. Furthermore, forensic experts examined the victim's body and found no traces of male biological material, casting doubt on the theory that the victim had been raped. At the same time, the pathologist confirmed that the wooden rifle, with a high degree of probability, was the murder weapon, as the injury characteristics indicated that the victim had been struck multiple times with it. Experts also did not find any defensive wounds on her body, suggesting that the victim did not resist the attacker. All possible evidence from Stacy's room was collected by crime scene investigators, but none of it furthered the investigation. At the time, DNA analysis was not commonly used, so the investigators could not examine the blood samples or other potential biological traces. Additionally, no fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, as the perpetrator had apparently wiped it clean with the towel. Despite the lack of leads, detectives still hoped that experts might find something in the room, so they decided to take fingerprints from all individuals who theoretically could have entered the women's dormitory. This task proved to be very difficult, as the police had to speak with hundreds of male university students and ask them to volunteer their fingerprints. They also took prints from all male staff members. The problem was that only girls lived in this residence, and a special key was needed to enter the building. Men could only enter in a few instances, such as being let in by residents or being college employees with a key. Nevertheless, the female residents frequently invited their boyfriends and male friends, which meant that the officers had to spend a lot of time collecting their fingerprints. However, in the end, this led to no results since no matching prints were found at the crime scene. With no leads, the investigators turned to a psychologist and asked for a psychological profile of the killer. After reviewing all the available information, the specialist posited that the attacker was likely a man between 20 and 24 years old with a strong physical build and no criminal record. The psychologist believed that the crime was not premeditated. The killer saw an opportunity and decided to attack the victim. This description made the officers further doubt that the criminal had entered the room through the window, as the hole in the mosquito netting was too small for a large, adult man to pass through. Meanwhile, panic spread among the college students. The female students were afraid to be in their residences, fearing they could become the next victim of the unknown assailant. The fact that the police could not find any clues only heightened the overall anxiety. The officers continued to search for possible suspects and decided to investigate Stacy's boyfriend, Tommy Osborne. They searched his room in the residence and found nothing to suggest his involvement. Investigators found it impossible to establish whether Stacy Pannell's boyfriend, Tommy Osborne, had any motive for her murder. According to Stacy's friends, the couple rarely argued and had no significant issues. However, the investigators learned from Stacy's parents that before starting college, she had another boyfriend named Ben with whom she had broken up just a few months earlier. Ben and Stacy had been in a long-term relationship during school, and he had even given her a ring, hoping to marry her in the future. But Stacy ended the relationship, and despite Ben's reluctance to accept the breakup and his refusal to take the ring back, Stacy did not change her decision. Up until Stacy left for college, Ben repeatedly tried to meet with her, but she remained firm in her decision. The detective spoke with Ben, who claimed that on the night of the murder, he was asleep at home. His mother corroborated his alibi, stating that he went to bed around 11 p.m. and was home the next morning. However, the investigators considered the possibility that Ben could have left the house undetected, gone to Stacy's college, committed the murder, and then returned home. Ben agreed to undergo a polygraph test, but the results were inconclusive. The operator could not determine if he was telling the truth. A second interrogation yielded the same results. This made the detectives suspicious, but without concrete evidence, they could not link him to the crime. Experts attempted to determine if the hair found on Stacy's bed belonged to Ben, but they were unable to reach a definitive conclusion. Since DNA analysis was not commonly used at that time to confirm or refute such evidence, it was not possible to do so. Due to the uncertain polygraph results, Ben became the prime suspect in the case, but Stacy's relatives did not believe he was capable of harming her. They described him as kind and well-mannered, always taking care of her. However, without evidence, the police could not charge him, and the search for clues continued. Later on, the investigators re-examined the case materials and noticed something peculiar. When examining the cut in the mosquito netting, they observed that the fibers were directed towards the outside rather than inside, indicating that the piece had been cut from within Stacy's room, not from outside. This discovery further puzzled the detectives. If the killer did not enter through the window, he must have had a key or entered with one of the residents. However, the police doubted this was possible since there was a guard in the dormitory who sat near the entrance and watched everyone who came in and out. For several months, there were no significant developments in the case. Then, the lead detective decided to seek assistance from Steve Rhodes, the sheriff of Illinois, who was well known in law enforcement circles for his unique approach to interrogations based on neuro-linguistic programming. He frequently spoke at police seminars and had a reputation for being able to extract information from almost any suspect and detect lies. Steve agreed to interrogate 4 people involved in the case: Stacy's neighbors Amy and Stephanie, as well as Ben and Tommy. In September 1986, he began his work, starting with Amy. She recounted everything she knew, and the officer found no reason to doubt her words. He then spoke with Stephanie, who said that on the night in question, she took an anti-inflammatory medication prescribed by a doctor and went to sleep. At around 12:30 a.m., Stephanie heard Stacy and her friends returning to the dormitory and talking loudly in Stacy's room. Stephanie went to ask them to speak more quietly. After her request, Stacy's friends left for their rooms, and Stephanie went to bed. However, Steve Rhodes, an experienced investigator, sensed that Stephanie was withholding important details. He accused her of lying and urged her to tell the truth. Despite Stephanie's insistence that she was not deceiving him, Rhodes continued to press her with questions until she finally revealed that she had returned to Stacy's room after the friends had left. This was a shocking development for the detectives, nearly a year after the murder. After a long pause during the questioning, Stephanie, to everyone's surprise, confessed that she had killed Stacy. According to Stephanie, she had entered Stacy's room for a chat. At some point, the conversation turned to Tommy Osborne, Stacy's boyfriend. Stephanie complimented Tommy, which upset Stacy. When Stacy demanded that Stephanie stay away from Tommy, the conversation escalated. After an exchange of words, Stacy slapped Stephanie, who retaliated in kind. The altercation became physical, and at some point Stephanie grabbed a wooden rifle next to the bed and struck Stacy, causing her to fall onto the bed. Stephanie then hit Stacy several times more until she stopped moving. Realizing what she had done after seeing the blood, Stephanie panicked and decided to dispose of the evidence. She locked the bedroom door, washed the blood off her hands, and then staged the scene to make it look as if someone had broken into the room, raped, and killed Stacy. She placed a pillow over Stacy's head, pulled down her underwear, and then cut a hole in the mosquito netting, hiding it in Stacy's closet under a pile of clothes. She cleaned the wooden rifle with a towel and took a shower to remove any traces of blood. Stephanie then decided to get rid of her t-shirt and the piece of mosquito netting she had cut. She locked herself in the bathroom and burned them to mask the smell of smoke by spraying a large amount of perfume. After covering her tracks, Stephanie went to bed and was only awakened when Amy knocked on her door. The detectives were astonished by this confession. For a whole year, it had never occurred to them that the killer could be a woman, let alone Stacy's dormitory neighbor. Stephanie was arrested and charged with Stacy's murder. 3 days later, she wrote a letter to her boyfriend, whom she had been dating for a week at the university, detailing the events and claiming it was an accident. She wrote that on the day of the murder, she had taken some energy pills and was not thinking clearly. She didn't even remember the moment of the murder, but had seen it in nightmares throughout the year. Days after sending the letter, the case took another unexpected turn. Stephanie claimed that Steve Rhodes had put her in some sort of trance using his techniques and had implanted the confession in her mind. She insisted she couldn't have killed Stacy and accused the police of taking advantage of her vulnerable state to close the case. According to her, the energy pills clouded her mind, allowing Steve Rhodes to convince her over time that she had indeed killed her neighbor. In 1987, a judge held 3-day hearings to determine the truth of her statements. The detectives asserted that Stephanie had not been subjected to any undue pressure and that no one had hypnotized her. They argued that in her confession, she mentioned details only the murderer could know, such as where she hid the knife used to cut the mosquito netting. The detectives hadn't found it during their initial investigation, But after Stephanie's confession, they found the knife in the closet under a pile of clothes. However, there were nuances. Firstly, the girls were neighbors and often entered each other's rooms, so Stephanie might have known about the knife's location under different circumstances. Secondly, no evidence could confirm or refute that the net had been cut with that specific knife. Nonetheless, the judge concluded that Stephanie's initial testimony was not obtained through hypnosis or any other form of manipulation. The trial began in 1988. Stephanie's lawyers continued to argue that her confession was coerced and highlighted the lack of evidence against their client. They emphasized that the lie detection tactics used by Steve Rhodes were not scientifically founded and could not be used in court according to the law. Rhodes claimed that one could tell if someone was lying by observing their eye movements. Furthermore, Stephanie's lawyers presented medical examination results indicating that her cognitive abilities could have been impaired due to the energy pills, making her more susceptible to manipulation like hypnosis. The prosecution argued that Stephanie knew details unknown to investigators at the time of the interrogation, making her testimony credible. They also conducted a court experiment with a psychological sciences doctor attempting to hypnotize her, concluding that it was not possible to induce such a state in her. The victim's relatives also shared interesting information, stating that Steve Rhodes had mentioned Stephanie several times, considering her a problematic person and to some extent fearing her. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the jury eventually found Stephanie guilty of involuntary manslaughter, sentencing her to 20 years in prison, of which she served 9 before being released on parole. Once freed, Stephanie continued to maintain her innocence and hired lawyers to revisit the case. During their review, the lawyers noticed similarities with another murder committed in 1993. At that time, a man named Charles Crawford attacked a girl who lived 40 minutes away by car from the college Stacy Pannell attended. There were some notable similarities between these two cases. Firstly, the other victim also attended Northeast Mississippi Community College in Boonville. Secondly, the perpetrator entered her home by cutting a hole in the mosquito netting. Stephanie and her lawyers believed that Charles Crawford could be behind Stacy's murder. Crawford was arrested in 1993 and subsequently sentenced to death. The challenge lies in the lack of evidence to prove his guilt in Stacy's case. However, there were significant developments. Stephanie's lawyers discovered that on the wooden rifle found at the crime scene, there was a drop of blood that did not belong to Stacy. DNA analysis of this evidence had not been carried out at the time, as a case review was necessary to proceed with it. Additionally, the victim's underwear was sent to an independent expert, and they were able to extract a DNA sample from an unknown male. This sample has not been added to the FBI's database for comparison with Crawford's DNA because a case review is required for that as well. Moreover, there is no guarantee that the sample found is related to the murder. Supporting the possibility of Crawford's involvement, the lawyers pointed out other facts. Crawford lived near the college at that time, and allegedly 2 witnesses saw him near the campus a few days before the murder. However, there is no reliable confirmation of this sighting. Despite similarities between the 2 crimes, there are discrepancies. The cut in the mosquito netting was made from inside the room to the outside, which discounts the possibility of an intruder entering from the street. Additionally, Crawford's height was 6 feet and 1 inch, making it unlikely that he could fit through such a small opening. Another contentious point is that the murderer used Stacy's wooden rifle as a weapon. If Crawford had really decided to enter the victim's room and kill her, it is hard to imagine that he would not have brought a weapon with him. Currently, Stephanie and her lawyers are still trying to obtain a case review that would allow comparison of the evidence with Crawford's DNA. Crawford remains on death row, having even spoken with detectives about Stacy's case, but the police could not determine if he was near the college on the night of the murder. You've just witnessed another unfolding story in Unreal True Crime. Lock in your support by subscribing and turning on notifications. Your insight could open the next story. Have a good day. By mid-2009, after 7 years of marriage, Lucy Landry began an affair with Gareth Jenkins, an old school friend she reconnected with on Facebook. She was tired of the 24-year age difference with her husband and his controlling nature, which had left her increasingly lonely and disillusioned. She asked her husband for a divorce and demanded that he, who was suffering from prostate cancer, pay £6,000 for a new flat for her and Mr. Jenkins to move into. The pair started to row constantly over money. On February 1st, in the presence of a neighbor, Lucy taunted her husband about naked photographs he had taken of himself 3 months previously, which she had found on his computer, calling him a pervert and taunting him that he should be on the sex offenders register. That night, they argued violently, following each other around the house, shouting and taunting each other over money, possessions, and Mr. Jenkins. The fight ended in a way that no one expected. Lucy Davies was born in 1971 in the county of Rhondda, England. She was the daughter of Roger and Andrea Davies, who were also the proud parents of another girl named Anna. The family was settled in a small community mainly formed by socially purposed housing. There, against the backdrop of beautiful mountain scenery, Lucy had a particularly happy childhood. Since she and her little sister had similar tastes, they were always very close. Her parents always highlighted Lucy's infectious joy as a standout quality. During her time in primary school, Lucy was known for her outgoing and likable temperament, which immediately endeared her to teachers and classmates alike. In addition to her charming personality, she was also recognized for her undeniable beauty, making her one of the most popular and admired girls at school. Regarding interests outside of academics, both she and Anna loved ponies. Knowing this, their father pleasantly surprised them by enrolling both in the local riding club. This sporting activity taught them discipline and also showcased their talent. Consequently, they earned the right to participate and represent the club in countless events and competitions. Thus, by the start of secondary school, Lucy shone as an exceptional rider. However, her energy and passion were not limited to the tracks, as the versatile young lady began to take flute and piano lessons, dedicating long hours to practice to master both instruments. Her efforts soon paid off, and by the following year, Lucy had a very comprehensive and detailed mastery of the wide field of classical music. Thanks to this, she was accepted into a youth orchestra and also joined her school's choir group. As often happens in this stage of adolescence, a healthy romantic interest appeared in her life, and Lucy became very close to Gareth Jenkins. However, she preferred to keep it a secret. In 1989, after finishing secondary school, Lucy was determined to pursue a career in the musical world. With that goal in mind, she enrolled to undertake a bachelor's degree at the University of Warwick. There, she began her new and promising life, always with the aspiration of becoming a teacher and dedicating herself to musical education. But things did not go as she had expected. While her passion remained, she did not enjoy the direction of the degree program. Consequently, she decided to switch her original plan and opted to study urban planning. It was around this time that she met Graham McAllister. They both discovered quite soon that their outlook on life was very similar. Aside from their love for art and shared interests, a crucial detail in their bond was the extravagant sense of humor that complemented each other. Their relationship flowed naturally, and as they made plans for the future, Lucy decided to introduce him to her parents. For Roger and Andrea, the meeting was wonderful, as they were certain that Graham was the right one for their daughter. So much so that they decided to buy Lucy a house in the city of Coventry, northwest of London. This gesture, in addition to ensuring her a life free from the upheavals of rent and moving, carried their wish for her to start a family. Shortly after moving in, Lucy invited her boyfriend to share the new home. As they continued with their studies in 1995, the young couple welcomed their first child, whom they named James. Lucy decided it was best to take a break from university to care for him. Meanwhile, Graham continued with his university commitments and, to support the household expenses, got a job working the night shift at the city's postal sorting office. Over the months, this dynamic began to affect Lucy, because alone at home, dedicated exclusively to the child, and with many hours away from her partner, a feeling of boredom took hold of her. Then, she found no better solution than to explore internet chat rooms for distraction. In this universe, she sought to meet new people. One night, while Lucy was immersed in lively conversations in various chat rooms, she came into contact with Harold Landry. At 53 years old and of American origin, Harold came from a financially struggling family in Louisiana. However, he understood early on that, being just one among a dozen siblings, he would have to achieve everything through his own effort and will. Thus, from a young age, he dedicated himself to hard work to escape poverty. His opportunity arrived when he realized that in the oil business, the key was not in owning a well, but in providing the essential infrastructure for the owners of such fields. Consequently, he founded his own company, focused exclusively on the design and manufacture of hydraulic equipment for major oil companies in the southern United States. As he had anticipated, the business allowed him to amass a great fortune, eventually reaching billionaire status. By that time, he divided his time between his eccentric hobbies and a property on the island of Cozumel in Mexico. On a personal level, he had been married and divorced twice. From these unions, he had children whose exact number and identities are not publicly known. What was known, however, was that Harold made sure they lacked nothing. A particularly relevant event occurred in 1992 when, being single again, he met a married woman 20 years his junior. However, neither her family nor her husband were obstacles for Harold, who directed all his seductive strategy towards her and won her over. On February 6, 1994, Harold picked her up to take her for a ride in New Orleans. For this occasion, they hired a babysitter. After concluding the evening, Harold accompanied his lover back to her home and offered to take the babysitter back to hers. No one seemed concerned about the fact that the husband would find out about the betrayal and could act as a wounded man. In fact, that's exactly what happened. Outside the residence, the betrayed husband was monitoring every move of his wife. Once the third party said goodbye, he followed him in his car. A few minutes later, Harold finally noticed the vehicle tailing him. Then, almost as an instinctive gesture, he opened the glove compartment and pulled out the firearm he usually kept. When both stopped at a red light, things spiraled out of control, as the babysitter later narrated. Harold then brandished a revolver at the betrayed husband and fired. The bullet severed an artery in his neck and damaged a nerve leading to a vocal cord. The husband called Chris Price, collapsed on the pavement with a wound on his neck, but fortunately, there was a hospital right in front of them, which allowed him to receive immediate aid, and the doctors were able to save his life. As for Harold, he was arrested and charged with attempted murder. The trial against him took place in 1997. In his opening statement, the defense attorney told the jury that Chris had only been the victim of a tragic and sordid affair. Regarding his client, he mentioned that he acted out of fear and in self-defense. The defense's clever strategy led the jury, consisting of 4 men and 8 women, to find Harold guilty of the lesser charge of aggravated assault. As a result, he was sentenced to 5 years behind bars. After appealing, Harold obtained probation. In exchange, he had to pay a fine of $500 and fulfill community service obligations. Although he sought to be completely exonerated, he thanked Pat for his hard work. Since then, they became great friends. Shortly after, Harold and Chris agreed on an undisclosed settlement amount. By the time Harold began talking with Lucy, he was residing in Covington and was still wealthy enough not to have to work. He was also honest about his occupations and everything related to his past life, including love affairs and legal details. But all these elements only served to increase Lucy's attraction to him. What followed was an engaging online romance, with Harold promising her a more than tempting lifestyle. His persistence and persuasive power bore fruit when Lucy finally asked Graham to end their relationship. Thus, he had the path clear, without a rival that could cause him trouble as had happened with Chris. With the wind in his favor in the early 2000s, Harold traveled to England to meet her, and she took the opportunity to introduce him to her parents as her boyfriend. Although Roger and Andrea were surprised by the significant age difference, they respected their daughter's decisions and did not object to the relationship. Feeling fulfilled and fortunate to share his life with her, Harold spared no effort to surprise her, whether with luxurious gifts or anything else Lucy desired. In fact, by then, he was so in love that he was already planning to propose marriage. However, he didn't want it to be just any proposal. He wished to do it in an ideal setting. To achieve this goal, he took her, along with her son James, and included Graham in the group on a trip. The chosen destination was Mexico, which for Harold was by then his favorite place in the world. Additionally, his longtime friend Pat, who had been his attorney in the past trial, also had an apartment close to his residence, which added to the feeling of comfort. Initially, Harold bought a diamond ring and shared the news with enthusiasm with Pat. Nonetheless, his friend harbored certain suspicions about his future fiancée. Moreover, over the days, Pat found it strange that Lucy had dedicated a good part of her time in the company of Graham. He seemed to be completely blind to it, and ultimately, he proceeded with his plan to propose. Lucy happily accepted the proposal, and in mid-2003, the couple celebrated their union. Shortly afterward, Harold surprised her by acquiring a $1 million property in an exclusive neighborhood in Worcestershire. In this rural setting, the marriage had a prosperous and peaceful start, further favored by the presence of excellent neighbors like Rachel Clark and Stephen Kennedy, with whom Harold and Lucy formed a lovely friendship. Soon, the newlyweds had their first daughter, whom they named Harriet. The event filled both Lucy and Harold with joy, and from then on, he dedicated himself to the little girl with undiminished energy and commitment. Equally important and affectionate was the relationship he maintained with James, whom he treated as if he were his own son. But relentless time began to erode their initial bliss. Gradually, the demands made towards Lucy increased, and her moodiness became directly proportional to her husband's demands. As he saw it, his wife was to constantly adjust to his preferences and adopt a submissive role to his requests. She, on the other hand, had different expectations, so tensions quickly became apparent. As a conclusion, Lucy was direct and unafraid to express her thoughts, and in this dynamic, her husband was not willing to yield. With both having volatile personalities, their arguments often culminated in explosive breakups, followed by reconciliation once the storm had passed. Thus, moments that had once been pleasurable, like the children's vacations, became increasingly marred by fights. Meanwhile, James witnessed the disintegration of his mother and stepfather's relationship. To their neighbors' dismay, the disputes that stretched on for hours became a sort of regular soundtrack. By that time, Rachel and Stephen were aware that the couple had a tendency to abuse alcohol, knowing well that this was the fuel that ignited their shouting and complaints. When Lucy and Harold unleashed all their anger, leading to prolonged periods of not speaking to each other, their neighbors felt peace return. In mid-2009, thanks to social media, Lucy reconnected with Gareth. Having had no contact since their platonic love in secondary school, they caught up and chatted for hours, with necessary interruptions due to both of their commitments. After Harold went to sleep, his wife stayed in front of the screen. Soon, it became evident to him that, feeling unhappy, his wife had resorted to the same escape route through which she had found him, and he had no doubt she was looking for a replacement. However, far from confronting her, he considered giving her some space and traveled to Mexico, where he stayed for a while. Meanwhile, Lucy took the opportunity to invite Gareth to stay with her. In the autumn of 2009, her husband returned to England, thinking this time would resolve their marriage. But as soon as he stepped into the house, Lucy asked him for a divorce. Initially, he felt devastated. Then, after a few weeks, Harold began a relationship. He met this new woman online. She lived in the vicinity and went by the name of Rachel. Parallel to each of their new romances, the divorce negotiations were underway, and as often happens, new conflicts emerged. Especially concerning the house, Lucy expected to keep it to ensure a roof over her children's heads. For Harold, on the other hand, this matter was non-negotiable. His solution was to offer her money to buy herself a more modest apartment on her own. At the same time, he completely excluded her from his will. Upon learning of the decisions of her still husband, Lucy flew into a rage. Her feelings of hatred towards him made her share everything about Harold's past with her son James, not leaving anything out. Amidst the complicated process and considering the evident tension she was living in, Gareth invited her to spend a few days with him in Wales. Upon her return to familiar surroundings, Lucy no longer wished to disguise or hide her lengthy phone conversations with her new love. Meanwhile, both she and Harold were immersed in excessive alcohol consumption. The arguments escalated to unexpected heights, leaving the children at the mercy of a violent and unbearable atmosphere. On the afternoon of Monday, February 1st, 2010, Harold drank several glasses of wine. At one point, he received a package intended for Stephen. Around 9 o'clock at night, when Stephen returned from work, he found a postal notification indicating that his parcel had been delivered to his neighbor. The Landry's lights were on, so he went there. Harold invited him in and served him a glass of wine. After greeting Lucy and exchanging a few words, Stephen noticed how drunk his host was. He took his package, excused himself, and left. Subsequently, the couple engaged in a nonsensical argument, specifically over a furniture purchase she was planning for their move. James acted as the years of fights had taught him. This time, the disagreement escalated to a physical altercation. In the scuffle, Harold grabbed a kitchen utensil with which he struck Lucy on the cheek. Unable to continue avoiding the facts, James appeared at the scene of the dispute and found his mother injured. He immediately called the police and then focused on securing his younger sister's safety. Not long after, Lucy and her children left the house seeking help. The first place she thought to go was to Stephen's house. However, just as she headed in that direction, Harold caught up to her and, with a knife, caused her multiple injuries. Then he left her under a bush in the garden and walked away. Alerted by the screams, Stephen went outside. It only took him a few steps to discover his neighbor. Although he initially thought she was unconscious, he quickly understood the severity of the situation. At that moment, responding to the emergency call, the police arrived at the scene. They called the paramedics and searched the vicinity for the perpetrator. However, they only found the children, hidden and terrified in the backyard amidst the darkness. Once on site, the paramedics acted as quickly as possible, and Lucy was transported to the hospital. Very shortly after, her heart stopped. Meanwhile, Harold went to Rachel's house and confessed that something terrible had happened, but without giving further details. He then gave her 3 bank drafts totaling $40,000, a sum of cash, the keys to his car, and several signed blank checks. Then he set off back home. By that time, several police patrols were trying to locate him. Eventually, they found him walking along the road and proceeded to arrest him. Roger and Andrea were overwhelmed with despair upon hearing the tragic news. In a statement shared by the police, they asked for respect during their time of unimaginable sorrow from losing their daughter. For now, they had nothing more to say to the media. From then on, all their attention was focused on looking after their grandchildren. The forensic examination confirmed that Lucy had died as a result of multiple stab wounds to the chest. With this evidence and having James as a first-hand witness, on February 5, 2010, Harold appeared before the court and was charged with murder. The trial took place in early February 2011. It was presided over by Judge David Foskett. On this occasion, Pat was not the defender of his friend. That task fell to attorney Andy Childs. Despite the evident difficulty of his task, the defense attorney argued that his client had been provoked by the fury of his wife, who left him no alternative but to act as he did. During his initial statements from the stand, Harold, amidst sobs, stated that he loved Lucy and regretted his actions. He then adhered to the strategy laid out by his lawyer, admitting to involuntary manslaughter because, in his words, Lucy had pushed him to the limit. To highlight the violence of the case, the prosecution presented a very detailed animation of the multiple injuries suffered by the victim. This presentation was shocking to those present in the courtroom. Finally, on February 24, 2011, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Harold Landry guilty of the murder of his wife, Lucy Landry, who was 38 years old at the time of her death, while Harold was 64. The following day was for the judge to impose the sentence. He had harsh words for Harold, whose attack he described as indescribable and unforgivable. He also dismissed Harold's claims of possible provocation by Lucy, considering them a vain attempt by the defendant to save himself. Consequently, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 16 years before being eligible for parole. By that time, however, he would be over 80 years old. Lucy's loved ones thanked not only for the resolution, but also for the judge's remarks, which they felt almost perfectly expressed what they themselves felt. They noted that the sentence somehow helped alleviate the pain of their loss, although they also admitted that no number of years in prison for Harold would bring back Lucy's life, so they would have to work on accepting this painful reality. For his part, Harold insisted on proclaiming his innocence, as he was heard saying he hoped to be able to appeal the sentence in the future. And that's the case for today. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. See you soon.